Well, we'll make a start, Mrs. Hamilton. What was your father's name?
Richard Cotter.
And how did he
Richard
come
Cotter.
to come here?
Well, he was working, he really came from Queenstown, Cove of Cork, Ireland. And he married Frances Emily Carhill at Ballarat in Australia. And they lived there.
Yes.
And then he and Mr. Fox and two other men, I don't remember, I have heard the other one's names, but I couldn't tell, but he and Fox were working together in a claim. And of course they heard about the New Zealand gold. And they decided they would come over and try their luck here. And Fox said he didn't have his passage money.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then my father, Richard Cotter, he said he would pay his passage money to Port Chambers, and they would go through together, which evidently they did.
Yes.
And then they came up through the Dunstan and over Cardrona Saddle to Arrowtown. They had a good claim here. But my father, Richard Cotter, he only stayed a few months as the first mail that they got after they had settled into their claim here brought him a letter from his wife to say their baby boy had been drowned.
Yes.
And of course he would go back.
May I interrupt you here? How did they come
Well,
from Port Chalmers to here?
They walked, and they had pack horses. They had pack horses that they brought their goods and blankets and everything on.
How long would the journey take?
Oh, it must have taken them weeks, many weeks. Mm-hmm. And there's one part on the Crown Range where it's called Fox's Short Track.
Mm-hmm.
That's evidently where they went over. And I've heard my father say, there's a book written by Gilkinson. Well, in that book he mentions where Cotter stayed on top of the saddle to waylay the party that was following them.
Yes.
That was Scholes, William Scholes and his party were following them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Richard Cotter that stayed and waylaid them, you see. And Fox got here 1 or 2 days before my father did.
Yes.
But when my father, Richard Cotter, arrived here, the 4 men worked together.
Yes.
Well, then he went straight away back, you see. He'd have to walk back, you see, over Cardrona Range and down to Dunstan to Dunedin and get the first boat. He couldn't have lost much time.
No.
And he took his gold with him. I told you how they divided their gold in the pannikins.
How did they do that?
Well, they had pannikins. They had no gold scales. They divided their gold in pannikins. First the pannikins of nuggets, and then fine gold. And when my father, Mr. Cotter, Richard Cotter, arrived at Ballarat, he put the nuggets in one pie dish and the fine gold in the other. And he told the 2 children they could play with the big nuggets. They were very interested, but not to touch the other gold.
No.
And they returned then. Mother wouldn't stay, you see, in Australia. And they came back again, I suppose, by return, because they were back again in 1862. And they arrived in Arrowtown on the 23rd of November, 1862. My mother walking from Dunedin to Kingston.
To Kingston.
Mm.
Mm.
And when they were leaving Australia, they brought a dog, a goat, a magpie, heaps of groceries, a bag of flour that went mouldy. When they arrived at Port Chambers, the goat walked from the ship to the wharf and dropped dead.
Oh.
An old married woman standing near went over to my father, Richard Cotter, and touched him on the arm, saying, "Young man, you go back across the water. You have no luck in this island." But he laughed, and after staying here years, they had 8 more children.
Oh.
Tom Cotter being the first white male boy born in Arrowtown. How many more you want?
That was the eldest boy.
No, he wasn't the eldest boy. He was the third boy.
Now, when they came here first, your mother and father, they brought over some of the family, did they?
They had 2 children.
2 children.
Yes, Ellie Cotter.
How old would they be?
And Pat Cotter.
Mm-hmm.
I think Ellie must have been about 7.
7.
And
how
couldn't tell
old
for
was the
certain. No, Pat would be 7. Ellie would be younger.
Yes.
And
how do you think they
well,
managed to carry them here? from the coast to Arrowtown?
From Kingston.
Yes.
Well, there was an old paddle boat on the lake, and they paddled across to Frankton Wharf. And Miss William Scholes met them there with a buggy and pair. And
the trip before then?
Well, they came from Dunedin to Kingston, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, they came in this tipped dray. My mother walked, and my father and the kiddies drove in the tipped dray. I've got that here, tipped dray. They walked from Dunedin to Kingston. My father drove the tipped dray and horse well loaded, the two children also sitting in it. When they arrived at Five Rivers, the horse and dray got stuck, and it took a wagon and 8 horses to pull it out. That being the only time that Mother, Mrs. Cotter, got into the wagon to have a rest. And now I told you about they arrived in Arrowtown.
That must have been a real marathon trip for a woman.
For a woman? Well, the condition she was in. Her baby was born 3 months afterwards.
Oh, goodness. I mean, it's hard to imagine, isn't it?
Well, she's told it herself often. They lived down on the beach. That's way down where the willows are. For some years.
Look, Mrs. Hamilton, we would like to go back to your father's first trip here. You mentioned they're dividing the gold. How did they come by that gold? Do you remember?
They had a very rich claim. That's what Fox, you see. Wherever they got their information from, Fox got his information from, he struck a good claim.
That was around here?
Yes, up the river somewhere. And Fox and my father and those 2 men worked on that claim for some time. And when my father came back in November, Fox and the 2 men were gone.
Yes.
But he never, ever afterwards struck such a good claim here.
No. Now, we would like to have a little more information about this man, Fox. What more can you remember your father having told you about him?
Oh, I really don't remember anything more. He always spoke of him as a very fine fellow. The 3 of them, they were good mates always and got on well together. And I think Fox was a very nice man. But he never ever can return to Arrowtown.
No.
Never ever, because different ones that were here in early days and then came back years later, they never ever mentioned anything about Fox.
No.
And my father never heard anything of him that I know of until he received the telegram from the West Coast.
Some years later.
Some years later, to say that Fox was dead, and would my father bury him, or help to bury him or something.
Yes.
That was, I think, that was the only thing ever I remember. But it was the Fox that founded Arrow was the Fox that came with my father, Richard Cotter, and came up over Cardrona Saddle. There was another brother Fox, Charles, I think they called him. Well, he came up the opposite way.
Yes. They called this place
They
early
called
on.
it Fox's for many
Oh,
years.
yes.
Yes, it was changed
Yes.
many years later.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Hamilton. Now we can carry on the story from where we left off before I interrupted you.
Well, I just said then they lived down on the beach for some years. There was one hotel, Melodies, a butcher shop kept by Sam Gower, and heaps of calico tents, sod huts, etc. One day when Tom Cotter was a wee boy, he fell into a water hole. The men around seemed afraid to go in to save him because they had on gum boots, and the water would have pulled them down with the gum boots.
Yeah.
From Mother's door, she saw that there was trouble. She went over to the hole. And when she went over, she saw the child in and jumped in. She had on a crinoline skirt that kept her afloat, and she saved Tom.
Oh, wow.
Didn't we used to? After the big flood in Arrow, everybody moved up to the new street, Buckingham Street. And in it there was the Bank of New Zealand, hotels, Butler's, Golden Age, Morning Star, Evening Star, New Orleans, and the Royal Oak.
Quite a number more than we have in Arrowtown today.
Well, then it might have been vintages with the first schoolmaster and all that, you see.
Yes. You mentioned Buckingham Street, Mrs. Hamilton.
Mm.
Is there any significance behind that name?
I don't think so, unless that it would be Buckingham Palace, perhaps.
I see.
Because the streets that are here named are all nearly Old English names in the streets of Era.
Yes. Oh, we'll just carry on from where we
Oh, it's where we were then. Where was it? Well, I have down here, you see, pieces taken from the time of the record rain. There was great celebrations at Era Town, and Mr. J.L. Job presented a bullock. It was roasted by James Webb, and the fire was donated by Peter Buttell. Mr. Preston was mayor of the city, and he delivered a most wonderful address at the celebrations. And in the evening then there was a plain and a fancy dress ball. That was to celebrate Queen Victoria's record rain. And you may have got that from somebody else.
Yes. I see you've got some quite interesting figures just further down there.
And down here?
Yes.
Well,
that'd be very interesting.
35 years ago in Era Town, there were 3 hotels. The Ballarat Hotel, owned by Dave Richardson, New Orleans Mrs. Dyson, Royal Oak John L. Job, one chemist W. Morrison, and the land agent Mr. L. H. Preston. Well, the prices going then, you could buy a bottle of Hennessy's 3-star brandy for 10 and 6pence, bottle of whiskey 4 and 6pence, wine 3 and 6, mixed shandy 6pence a bottle, gin 3 and 9 to 4 and 6. To 4 and 6. Oh, yes, I should have gone over. And there were 2 butchers and bakers, Joe Jenkins, Romans and McSkimmings. 3 general merchants, R. Pritchard, Joe Jenkins, and Cotter Brothers. And their prices for a 56-pound bag of sugar was 10 and 3pence. 50 of flour, 7 shillings. Tin of kerosene, 5 and 6. Packet of candles, 6pence. Tea ranged from 1 and 6 per pound. And ladies' hose, 2 shillings per pair, only in black.
Only in black.
Mm.
Did they care very much for wearing black stockings in those days?
Oh, we never bothered. You see, we thought it a terrible crime when the cream stockings came in years later under the navy blue frocks. There were 2 blacksmith shops in Yarra in 35. Spence Peacock one, Joe Reed another one, and W. Murphy another one. The Bank of New Zealand, Mr. Gifford was the manager, and Mr. Turton was a solicitor. This is old. I don't suppose
what
that's
were women's fashions like in those early days, Mrs. Hamilton? Could you just give us a description?
Oh, the crinoline skirt was the skirt, with all the wire round. A small one right for the waist, and then so many inches below, and right to the foot of the skirt was this round hoop. Because when you went to sit down, I suppose it would be rather awkward. I have had photographs of it. I'll have to hunt them out. They always dressed beautifully, really. The elderly women, like now, women over 60 years of age, many years ago, they dressed beautiful to what they do now. They dress, younger.
Yes.
But the women then, they used to dress beautifully in black. Look at that photo of Mother on the.
And they made a feature of
and
their...
they used to wear pretty little caps in the house, and going out they wore very pretty bonnets with feathers, a little dash of colour, and what they called dolmans. Well, the dolmans were beautiful.
What were they?
Instead of these summer coats or a coat, they wore the dolman. And the dolman came round the shoulders, high up round the neck, and right down the front.
Like a cape.
Like a cape. Really, they always looked, so, graceful going out.
And would most of these items of clothing, would they mostly be handmade, sewn at home?
Oh, there was no machines here in the early days. I've heard my mother say that, you see, she had 9 children here in New Zealand she had to sew for, and she made all the clothing.
Hand sewn?
All hand sewn, and for her baby, her baby linen was beautiful. I quite remember seeing it. And the first cricket match that was held at Arrowtown, Mother made all the men's white trousers.
Moleskin or just
No,
white?
a white material, and she made their caps. Because when she was in America, she was a cap and mantle maker. That was her trade.
Yes.
She came to
She's
Australia
a
and
very
got
handy
married.
woman here.
Oh, yes. Oh, it was years and years before a machine came here. But, there's some wonderful sewers about here. And with the old identities, one helped the other.
Yes.
I've known a woman to come into my mother's house and say, with a bit of brown velvet, and she said, look, I'll do your ironing for you if you'll cut out this suit for Michael.
Right.
Well, eventually Mother finished the suit. They were very, very homely, always.
Yes.
It was quite different to now.
Very generous.
Very, very generous. One would always help another, and all through the sickness, you see, there's years before there were doctors here.
Yes.
Many years. Dr. Douglas came from Scotland, and there was a Dr. Scott living here in Arrow. There was a miner hurt down on the beach. I've only heard of this.
Yes.
And the miners sent for Dr. Scott, and he went over, and he said, who's going to pay me for this? And they hunted him,
Go on.
and they sent to Frankton for the young doctor that had just arrived a little while, Dr. Douglas, and he came over and he said, oh, I'll take him to the hospital with me. He'll be quite all right. So it was Dr. Douglas from that out was the head doctor in Arrowtown.
Quite.
Dr. Scott wasn't long before he went away. I've heard that from, just from my mother talking about it.
Were there early missionaries in your district, as far back as you can remember?
Yes, I have heard about the foundation stone of the Catholic Church here. It will be this month on the. I sent it away to the table. Foundation stone of St. Patrick's Church, Arrowtown, was laid in November the 9th, 1873, by Bishop Moran of Dunedin, Reverend Father Coleman Dunedin, and Reverend Father Mackay was parish priest. It was opened in the March 1874. And the first priest that I heard my mother talking about was coming here to celebrate Mass was Father Maru. And when they got word that he was coming, of course they were very, very thrilled to think of a priest coming to say Mass, as all Catholics are. And it was my mother, Mrs. Cotter, and a Miss Flannery, who were to prepare the place for the priest. And the little cottage they were to put him into had no door, so they nailed up a grey blanket. And then the query was, what would they give him as vegetables, substitute? And they picked the dock leaves that grow around here as a weed now, and they boiled them as a substitute for cabbage for the priest. And he came and celebrated Mass. Well, he was the first one that I heard them talk of.
Yes.
After that there was Father Martin and lots and lots of other. I forget that I have them down here somewhere. Just come on.
Yes.
But
Have you heard any stories about early Chinese in this district?
oh yes, we had.
Come on now. Tell us a few of them, Mrs. Hamilton.
Perhaps someone's told you.
Oh, no. We're very interested in this subject.
Well, there was down on the beach. It was called Chinese Town.
Yes.
Because there was such a number of Chinese there. And some of them were very nice nice and friendly, you know. And they would work the claims after the Englishman.
Yes.
Because they said a Chinaman would live where an Englishman would starve. And they would always seem to have plenty of money. And when they would come into a store, you know, they were always able to pay for anything at all that they bought.
Did they come here individually or under a boss man?
No, the first lot of Chinamen that came here came with my brother-in-law, William Owen of Dunedin.
Yes.
He brought up a wagon load full. How many was in that wagon? Francis, it's 70. Aunt Ellie said. And he brought them from Dunedin, and when they arrived in Arrowtown, they pulled in at that section by the bank.
Yes.
And he discovered his wagon was walking alive with lice.
Oh.
And he hunted them, of course. So they paid him liberally for whatever he asked, you see, for their fare up. And it took him a week to clean the vermin out of that wagon before he could return to Dunedin.
Yes.
Well, that was the first of I heard of the Chinaman coming here.
Mm-hmm.
But they had a long store, and when they had their New Year, they used to put on a wonderful feast.
Could you describe that for us briefly?
That feast?
Yes.
Oh, I only remember seeing it as a child, and I got very frightened. I went down with my sister Sarah and Mr. and Mrs. Stoddard. George Stoddard was the tailor here. And, of course, we were very great friends, and he came over and he said to Mother that they were going down to the New Year and let the girls go with them. And away we went. And they had it was a very long store, awfully long, but one huge big room and a long centre table. When on that table to me appeared to be everything you could think about.
To eat.
To eat. And, of course, they were giving the English people the preserved ginger in the little jars, most beautiful.
Yes.
You can't get it now.
No.
And, cakes and lollies and everything. But as a child, I was always afraid of Chinamen. And when they came up to give me my share, I left.
You took to your heels.
I took to my heels. Of course, as time wore on, I didn't get so afraid of a Chinaman.
Did you find in later life that you have any foundation for your childhood fears of them?
No, none whatever.
Mm-hmm.
No Chinaman ever molested me in any way or, frightened me in any way. No, they were all very nice.
Quite law-abiding.
Quite law-abiding. And, of course, they had the opium, and they used to hide their opium, and they would sell it, quietly.
Yes.
Sell it quietly. And they had a secret drawer in a table where they hid it.
Yes.
Not in the long store, but in another Chinese house, a big stone place. And one of the Chinamen wanted some opium one day, and the head man wouldn't give it to him. And he turned informer, and he told the policeman where they had their opium. And, of course, they didn't. It was taken from them, and they were heavily fined, and they didn't get opium then for many years.
Mm.
They used to go then, another Chinaman came, and he used to get it from Dunedin, bring it up quietly from Dunedin. I'd never enjoyed it.
Well, we'll just take a spell for a moment then, Mrs. Hamilton.
And just mention about that one rowan tree with
Yes, give us the
right
story
in
about
front of the rowan tree. Well, in front of the council chambers, there was a rowan tree. Most beautiful one it was. Everyone admired it. And Mr. L.H. Preston was then town clerk. One day there was a terrific storm in the town, and that rowan tree was split right in half. The first door that opened was the council chambers door, opened by L.H. Preston. He was the first to see it. He saw it split in two. Sarah Cotter, now Mrs. McBride of Queenstown, and Mr. W. Selby, then tailor at Arrowtown. They were the next two to view the accident. Mr. Selby came over after all the bustle and hustle was over to Mrs. Cotter's, and he said, "I do feel sad over this accident. If it happened in England, all the town folk would be watching for a death within 24 hours. Next afternoon, Mr. L.H. Preston was up on the Crown Terrace, driving a single buggy and horse, and he had with him his two little girls, Lucy and Gwen. Going down an incline to Alf Miller's farm, the britchin broke, the horse bolted. There'd been no brake on the buggy. Mr. Preston was killed. The two little girls were uninjured. Mrs. Preston was in Gore, and there was her three little girls at home alone, Blanche, Lucy, and Gwen. But in Arrowtown in those good old days of long ago, they were not left long alone, because all the neighbours flocked to help her. Mrs. Preston returned the next day, put her shoulder to the wheel, and carried a very heavy cross.
Mm. What a curious
It was a
coincidence.
curious
Yes.
thing, wasn't it?
Yes. What was that other story you mentioned about the rats?
Oh, yeah. rats. There was an old man up the river called Jonas. Couldn't tell his other name. And he was an old man, German, and used to cook very nicely.
Yes.
Well, there was another old miner, Harry. Can only give you their Christian names.
Mm-hmm.
But Harry was very fond of visiting Jonas about once a week. But he always arrived at dinner time, and he had a wonderful appetite. Old Jonas got rather tired of this visit and the big appetite. So one day he had his dinner all finished when Harry arrived. And he said, "I've just finished my dinner, but I'll give you what I have left of the stew." Harry did ample justice to the stew. He said it was lovely. It was the best stew he had ever tasted. And Jonas said, "Yes, I happened to catch a fine big fat rat this morning. It made a good stew." Harry hurried outside, and needless to say, he got rid of that stew, and he went home. And when Jonas was relating it to his friends, he said, "The rat did it." That's all I have of that one.
Now, Mrs. Hamilton, did your father know Bully Hayes?
Yes, he knew Bully Hayes. He had a dancing hall and what kind of a hotel, I suppose, would be.
Yes.
Because in those days they didn't call them hotels. They called them all shanties.
Shanties, I see.
Yes, there was no such a thing as a hotel. It was all shanties. And and nearly everybody that could manage it had a little bit of a store,
Yes.
a bit of a grocer's store. And my mother, Mrs. Cotter, even went in for one of the little stores.
Yes.
And it was down on the beach.
And you say Bully Hayes ran one of these shanties?
He had one of those shanties.
Yes.
And he was here for quite a long time, Billy Hayes. And at night they used to have dancing. You know, they'd dance well into the hours of the morning. And I couldn't tell you, I don't remember anything very, very much about Bully Hayes. I used to hear them talking about him now and again.
Yes.
But from what they spoke of him, he never seemed to be a great favourite.
No.
He was a regular bully, from what his name was appropriate to him, evidently. Because nobody ever seemed to think much about him. Oh.
Yes, tell us about that one.
Oh, well, there was a Chinaman, he was called Arsap. And he lived down below the bank there, where the Bank of New Zealand is now, just opposite, away from it. He had a long vegetable garden in his house. And then the stone house that's on the corner now that Mr. Erridge lives in, there was a Mrs. Welsh lived in that. And she had a little boy. And the banker had a little boy, Jack Barlow. And then Mr. Fielding, the shoemaker, he had a little boy. Well, it was a great place there to go seesawing,
Yes.
of all of them. And evidently this day, the bigger boys had been there seesawing and had teased Arsap. And they went away. And Arsap came out and he discovered those three little boys on the seesaw. And he grabbed them. He took them into his garden and he had a big hole and he put them into it. A sheet of iron over them, just their heads showing. And he started to bury them. He grabbed two boys and Willie Fielding ran home and told his father. That's what it was. And Mr. Fielding came down just in time to see Arsap going to bury the other two boys. And of course he caught the Chinaman and I think he kicked him where he'd feel it. And then he ducked him into a tub of water.
Yeah.
And of course the Chinaman went and told the policeman, and the policeman came up and he, there was a little bit of trouble about it. I couldn't exactly tell you all the details of it, but however the judge told Mr. Feely that he could have pulled the Chinaman's nose, but he couldn't kick him where he did.
Wonder he didn't cut off his pigtail.
Oh, no, they had their pigtails. Oh, yes, they had great pigtails.
What can you remember about their pigtails? Any stories about those?
Oh, well, they always used to keep them well wound up and tied with the blue or red cord, just at the end, you see. And kept them all. They wouldn't let anybody touch their pigtails.
Was it sacred?
Hmm?
Something sacred?
But it was something very sacred. Oh, yes, very sacred.
What was the idea behind not cutting the pigtails?
Because they could not go back to China if they found their pigtail.
Oh, I see.
If they took off their pigtail, they were not allowed to go back to China with it on.
Were any practical jokers around who
Oh,
attempted to cut
yes.
their pigtails?
There was one up at Skipper's, and I think they got his pigtail arranged through his hut and wound it round something else, you see, and he had to cut it off himself to get free. But he never ever went without a hat. He wouldn't go anywhere unless he had a hat on, that Chinaman. Nowhere at all. And you just, you start to think about...
Now, Mrs. Hamilton, you've told us quite a good deal about your father's activities here. What about your husband?
My husband, Alexander
when did
Hamilton.
When did his people come here?
Oh, yes, I'll look about his people. Yes, my husband's people, James Hamilton and Mary Hamilton, well, they came from Stonehurst in Scotland in 1863 in the ship Helen's Leaf. On her second voyage out, they left home with 2 children, Margaret and Jean, the latter dying on the journey out. They landed in Invercargill. James Hamilton worked for his brother, John Hamilton, who had a sawmill. And James Hamilton, Mary Hamilton, his wife, was very lonely as they lived in the bush. And there was only one woman and herself. They saw an advertisement for a married couple wanted for Scholes' farm near Arrowtown. And she got her husband, James Hamilton, to apply for it. He was successful, and they came to the Waikato. They did not stay long at Scholes' as Miller's flat was being taken up for farms, and they secured a farm and worked on it like niggers, rearing a family of 12 children. Well, you see, one of those 12 children was my husband, Alexander Hamilton. Don't want to give you all the names. The family went to the Miller's Flat School, but Mary Hamilton wanted Alexander to be a minister, and she sent him to Lower Shotover School to finish off his education. He very often played the wag, and eventually went playing for old John Brown, who one day gave him a cheque for £2, which he took home to his mother, Mary Hamilton, a very proud boy, and that finished the idea of the minister. Then, you see, in years afterwards, he married Annie Cotter, and that finished the minister altogether. Well, have you met farming? Farming in those days was very slow work at milking.
Yes.
The milking was done all by the hands and was set in large tin dishes. After being skimmed, the milk was heated, the calves fed.
Can you remember this yourself? The idea of skimming
oh,
the
yes,
milk?
many a dish I skimmed.
Yes.
We had cows too, you see. I skimmed milk and made butter. I had one cow and made 12 pounds of butter a week with her.
Yes.
And she took for 4 years in succession, she took first prize at the show, Lake County and Peter Sidey show.
Did they use the little pat
Yes, I've got patty pans here yet.
that left the print on the butter?
Oh, yes, that's a different kind. Yes, and I have the little one like the hand.
Oh,
It's
yes.
all streaked.
Yes. And what about these with the
With the thistle and the shamrock and the rose and all that on the top. Well, they
Those
were
were
round
used
ones.
commonly, were they?
Oh, yes, they were commonly used. Well, John Hamilton came out to Australia. He and another young lad like himself came to New Zealand. And where Caversham Dunedin now is, they ploughed and sowed a crop of wheat. It was just ready to cut when Gabriel's Gully, Florence, broke out. and they left their wheat crop and went to the gold rush. John Hamilton did well and went back to Australia and brought over a shipload of horses and farming implements and took up land at Forest Hill. He then sent for his brother James Hamilton and Thomas Hamilton. That John Hamilton is Adam Hamilton's father. And John Hamilton and my husband's father were brothers. It was John Hamilton who imported the first pair of rabbits into Southland and also the first Ayrshire cow from Scotland to Southland.
Can you remember a little bit more detail about these rabbits? We're very intrigued by these early stories of rabbits.
Of rabbits? Oh, I remember rabbits here. We used to have them as pets, white rabbits with pink eyes.
Where had they come from?
And, well, I don't know where they came from to Arrowtown. I don't know who imported them here. I never ever heard. But the place was alive with them for years and years. And they used to go rabbiting, you know. It was a great go for the young schoolboys to get a few traps and go out catching them. Or get a ferret and go out ferreting. I remember my brothers going ferreting.
Would you just mention that again, the fact that, perhaps without reference to the notes, about the first pair of rabbits coming into Southland? Would you just mention that for us again?
It was John Hamilton who brought the first pair of rabbits into Southland from Scotland to Southland. And he also brought the first Ayrshire cattle. Is that what you want?
Yes. How did he come to bring the rabbits out, do you think?
Oh, he'd have to bring the rabbits out in a little box.
What made him bring
I suppose
these out?
they'd just think of them as pets.
Yeah.
Think that they were going to do good. Of course, I've no idea of all the harm they've done. But rabbits now are finished. They're done for.
You mentioned that your husband followed. What did he follow in Arrowtown?
In Arrowtown, he was manager of the Shamrock Claim, and then eventually here he was head raceman for the public works on the irrigation works after they started. Before that, he went in for mining, and he was down in Southland farming, and then he had the contract of drawing the timber from the left-hand branch to Bullendale that they used in the mine there, in the tunnel.
Yes.
We're still building it in.
Did he strike any very big claims in the mining days here?
Oh, up at Shotover he did, but the Shamrock Claim, eventually had to close down on account of the First Great War. They couldn't get the men to work, you see. And he had to give up managing it on account of being so many years wearing gum boots. It affected him.
Did you ever hear your husband talk about his find at the Shotover?
Oh, well,
in more detail?
I often saw the gold that they got up out of the claim at the Shotover.
Yes.
It was very, very nice gold. Beautiful gold.
Nuggets?
Yes, nice nuggets. Very nice. There was quite a lot of it. And in the winter time, when they couldn't work the claim at the Shotover, he and his mate, James Harbour, they went rabbiting.
Yes.
And with the rabbiting, you know, they did terribly well, because there were loads of rabbits up there, and they sent down their skins, you see, all well wired and so, but they used to send them to Dunedin and get a good return.
Yes. That's during the hard winter months.
That was during the very, very hard winter when you couldn't possibly work at Bullendale. Because I've notes here of Bullendale, but then you don't have to put them in, I don't suppose.
What other great or well-known characters of the early mining days that you can remember? You've told us about the Chinese, and made some mention of Bully Hayes, and one or two others. Any other well-known characters you can think of, Mrs. Hamilton?
Oh, yes, there was a Mr. Chain here.
Yes.
And there was a William Murphy, and they were both a pair of hard cases, but they were not in the very earliest of days.
No.
They were more here when, you see, yes, when about 45 years ago, or 40. And they'd play any joke at all. They were always ready for a joke, and they always saw the funny side of everything.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't matter what. At the New Orleans Hotel, the lavatories there were down towards the back lane.
Yeah.
And strange to say, the ladies and the gents were back to back.
Mm-hmm.
Mrs. Dyson was a home woman. She was Cornish, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And she also my Godlands. And she called the backyard her backside.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just her manner of
Just
expression.
yes. And there was one morning, as soon as she had her breakfast, her first visit was down to the lavatory.
Mm-hmm.
No one dare go before her.
No.
And this morning she went down and she came back now and she said, "Well, my Godlands, there's someone sitting there for me." And she waited. Well, still they were sitting there. And still sitting there. And she said, George," that was her eldest boy, George, get away down," she said, and sees who there is sitting there. "Tell him get out of it," she said. And George went down, he came back and he said, "Oh, mother." It was only a man made up out of bags or a woman or something. "Oh, yes," she said, "Murphy again." She wanted the yard cleaned up. They had stables and used to, they ran a livery stables, you see. And she'd say, "Go on, boys, get away down there and clean up that backside of mine. I want it all well cleaned up today." And always we used to laugh, it sounded so funny.
Do you remember any of the early police constables here?
Yes, Mr. Sergeant Brown. I remember when I was a very tiny little girl.
Yes.
He was here with his family, and he was here for many years, Sergeant Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And he had quite a big family.
Mm-hmm.
We used to go down into the jail and play there. And then there was Constable Wade and Constable Barrett, and they were both under Sergeant Brown.
Yes.
And they were prohibited from fishing in Lake Hayes.
Mm-hmm.
And they put Constable Wade on as the ranger.
Ranger, yes.
Trying to think what it was. 71, I'm beginning to get a dead memory. And however, some of the lads, Dick Cotter among them, and Willie Williams, said, "Oh, well, they would try Wade out." And they went out and they caught some very nice fish. And they took one down, rolled it up nicely, and hung it on Wade's door. And they told Sergeant Brown what they had done.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "Well, I'll take a watch and see what they were going to do." He said, "I'll watch and see what he does." And however, he took it inside.
Whipped it onto the frying pan.
I suppose so.
And was Sergeant Brown a particularly
Sergeant
good
Brown,
man? Was he
oh,
well respected
yes,
here?
he was well respected.
Mhm.
Very, very well respected. But
Can you remember any early trouble in which the police perhaps
Constable
took a
Wade,
hand?
he wasn't very popular. He was a short, thick little fellow. But when he would be taking the men worse a liquor to jail, he was not nice with them.
No.
No, he used, he was kind of hard, cruel with them. I know we kids used to be awfully put out.
Perhaps he had to be hard.
Perhaps he had to be. And I've heard my mother say that the first woman she ever saw being taken to jail in Arrow, they were taking her down in a wheelbarrow.
Go on.
And as she passed my mother's door, Mother had brought this magpie from Victoria with her and could talk. And she said, "Oh, you robber. Oh, you robber." And the old lady said, "I'm not a robber. I might be fond of drink, but I never robbed."
And they wheeled her away in the old wheelbarrow, did they?
We took her away in the old wheelbarrow.
Do you remember anything
And then
about
there was
the treatment of the early prisoners here? Before
Oh,
they had a jail, say.
before they had a jail, they used to chain them to a log, I think it was. Because the log is still down there on the
That's
chain,
right.
isn't it? Well, I think
Whereabouts
so.
is that?
Mr. Ogilvy would show you.
Is it?
Down here. Down at the police camp.
Oh, yes.
Yes, they, the first, of course, when I remember, the jail was there. You see, I'm only 71, you see, I'm young.
And tell us
And,
more about this log.
They used to, well, they had evidently no place to keep them much, and until they would come to take them, I suppose, to Clyde, I don't think Queenstown was any better off. They used to just chain them up to this log, you see, and I don't know where they put them at night. I've never heard them say.
No. Did any of them get away from the log, or
Oh, I don't think so.
with
And
the
there
log?
were never no escapes out of the jail that ever I remember of at all. There was a man being taken away to Seacliff one time. His mind was deranged, and his niece and I used to take his dinner to him at dinner time, because he wouldn't take it from anybody else, but he would always take it from her. And this day he asked her to get him a rope, because he had made the discovery where he could get out. And if she would take him a rope, he would get out, because he was taken away the next day.
I see. Did you ever
Well,
see any of the gold escorts?
Yes, I did.
Now, give us a description of
The
them.
gold escort would arrive from Queenstown in Cobb and Co.'s coach with a policeman or two sitting on the box seat, I suppose with revolvers.
Yes.
And they usually had 4 horses, fine spanking horses, and then there would be a mounted police at each side of the coach.
How would they be dressed?
Oh, they were dressed in the great big high policeman's hats and, the uniform. Riding trousers and everything. Very nice, what I remember of them.
Dark
And
coat?
from our kitchen window, we used to see Cobb and Co.'s coach arrive every morning at 7 o'clock. And they changed horses there. And anyone on the coach who required breakfast could go into the Royal Oak Hotel and get it. And then they went on again, you see, to Clyde. And I've often heard my father and mother talk about the big gold robbery here, the time the escort was robbed in Clyde. And it was the shoemaker, Rennie, who got in touch with the police, and they made the arrangements themselves. I suppose you've read it all in the paper about that big gold robbery.
No, I haven't.
Have you not? Oh, I couldn't give it to you all exact from, detail. But this Rennie had a saddler's shop or a bootmaker's shop, or combined, just beside the Royal Oak Hotel. And he and this policeman in Clyde arranged that he would go from here to Clyde, you see, and be waiting there when the escort arrived.
Yes.
And then they put the gold away in the what they call it, the no, it was a room. What do they call those great big rooms again?
Strong room?
Strong room. Thanks. In the strong room, but the policeman there didn't lock the door. And then when Rennie went in, you see, he was able to take the gold, and he took it on his horse. And they came up over the Cardrona Range, but he got afraid after he left Clyde, and here and there, in different places, he buried some of it.
Yes.
And when he came up onto the Crown Range, he very foolishly let his horse go, set fire to his saddle, and walked home, and went into bed dressed, with his boots and everything on.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, they discovered the gold missing the next morning. A hue and cry went out, and I think they were able to trail him. They found this burned saddle on the Crown Range, and I don't know where his horse wandered to, but then they came and he was still in bed and asleep with his boots on. And they told him that the policeman in Clyde had turned King's evidence and had confessed everything, and he better do the same. And of course the policeman hadn't, you see. They already confessed everything. I've heard both father and mother and other ones in the house
Mention that.
mention. And you know how easily Rennie had been led away.
Yes. What happened to poor old Rennie?
Oh, he got years. Oh, he was taken to Dunedin and tried. I have read that in some other books too. I've read of it because I knew of it from
Yes,
my father.
from your
and
parents,
mother.
yes.
What was the parents?
What was that you were saying about the mother of that man when they lived at Bush Creek?
Oh, the bushranger. Oh, yes, that was, I'd forgotten about that. Here it is. At one time there was a bushranger at large up in Bush Creek. And then Bush Creek
Where
was
is
very
Bush
thickly
Creek?
covered. This bush up here, just
Oh,
straight
yes.
up this way. It was very thickly covered with bush. The police were hunting for the ranger, and all the folk living in the calico tents were in fear. Late one evening, at Cotter's tent, Mrs. Cotter answered it. A strange man asked her in a very gruff voice to go and get him a drink of water. Fortunately, at the tent door was changed the big dog. Mrs. Cotter stood by the dog and called out to Richard Cotter, her husband, to bring out a drink to this man. He took
That's your mother, of course.
That's my mother and my father.
Mm-hmm.
He took the drink of water, drank it, and threw the empty cup at Mrs. Cotter, and off for his life on his horse. A few days later, that same man was arrested as the notorious bushranger.
What was his name? You remember?
I don't know.
The
Of
notorious...
course, there was different ones, bushrangers, not all up here, but down around Cromwell and Alexandra.
Yes, right through.
Butler was one fellow's name. He was a very bad bushranger. You know, Butler and... I have heard their names.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to think of some other thing.
Yes, I think we'll just take another short spell there.
He arrived here from Australia, young man, and he was going around shearing. I don't know exactly where, but however, one day he arrived in Arrowtown and he went into the Royal Oak Hotel. Old Monday was there. That was an old miner.
Mm-hmm.
Some other old fogies that used to enjoy a glass. And when the strange young fellow walked in, they asked him to join them, have a glass. He had it. And he started to tell them about the shearing he was doing and all the sheep he could shear. And they waited for a while. Then old Monday said, "Well, young man, you might be a very good shearer, but you're a mighty poor shouter."
What line did you follow yourself here before you were married, Mrs.
I was
Hamilton?
in a general store and bookkeeper.
Did you enjoy working in the store?
Yes, I enjoyed it immensely, every bit of it.
I suppose you'd come into contact with
You come in contact
a
with
great
such
number of miners.
well, not as much then, in my time, as used to
Farmers?
come. It was the farmers.
Yes.
Arrowtown on a Saturday was a wonderful day because all the farmers came into town for their groceries and brought in their butter and eggs and
Yes.
everything.
And
to
this
sell.
would be approximately what year?
It was
that
the,
you
it
first
was the
started?
35, I think. Was it? No. I was married in 1912. Well, I was for 10 years before that in the working in the shop.
Yes.
And,
in the late,
oh, yes.
early 90s.
Early 90s it was.
Yes.
90. I was working in the store in the big 1903 snow,
Mm-hmm.
and it commenced on a Friday night, 5 o'clock, and by 6:30, I suppose there was about 3 inches of snow on the ground. And we all closed the stores, Jenkins's, Pritchard's and Cotter's, and went home. And the next morning, my brother came from his house, Dick Cotter, down to my mother's, and he said, "Don't go to work, you or Bessie," that was the dressmaker,
Yes.
"until I come back." Because the snow was so deep, it was right up to our door handles.
Go on.
And he never came back until dinner time. And when Bessie and I went to go up to our work, we couldn't be seen, either of us, above the snow. They had just shovelled enough But it was so heavy. You see, all that they could make was a small track. And that was on the Saturday. Well, on the Monday, it was, the snow had ceased, but on the Sunday night it commenced to freeze. And for 6 solid weeks, we'd frost. And on the Monday at dinner time, I heard something trickling in the store. I went to see what it was, and it was liquids, you see, such as magnesia and vinegars, or anything in the way of liquid, was all running down the shelves. Well, we had to get to, and in the office, put in boxes, filled with straw, and put everything we could put into that office, and keep a fire going night and day. In the hotels, every bit of liquid in the hotels froze, excepting whiskey. There's no water in it.
Must have been good whiskey.
All the gums around the place got frosted and died, and the hens died, were frozen stiff on their perches and fell off. It was the most terrible winter. It was dreadful.
Any cases of frostbite about?
Oh, yes. There was different ones. Old Mr. Bell of Long Gully, he was frostbitten that year. His feet frostbitten and his hands. He eventually died.
Where was he?
Up
out
Long
indoors?
Gully. Yes, he was out. He was outdoors. Got benighted going home. There was just terrible damage done that year. And the sheep, when the springtime came and all the snow had gone, on top of all the fences, you could see the wool of where the sheep had walked from one paddy to another. They'd no need to. There was no keeping a sheep in anywhere. They could go anywhere.
Snow was over the fence
Snow,
line.
oh, yes, much over the fence line.
Yes, I suppose you'd meet one or two quite funny characters coming into the store from time to time in those early 90s.
Oh,
You wouldn't
no.
you wouldn't care to tell us the story about the Chinaman? We'd love to hear it.
They couldn't put that in print.
No, well, we won't put it in print. We guarantee it.
Seems so ridiculous to put in print. I don't-
It's not very original.
Oh, no, it's an original yarn.
Very,
It
yeah.
happened to myself, you
Yes.
see.
Yes, well,
Well, I was in the store at dinner hour, alone, and this old Chinaman came in, and he asked me for something, which I did not understand, and I passed him down a pound of Chinese tea, and he said, "No, you no savvy." And he told me again, and I passed him a pound of candles, and he said, "No." And passed him then, I think it was a tin of cocoa, and he said, "No, you no savvy," and he leant over the counter. And he took his hand and he said, "Pour it in, stir him round, drink him down," and he patted himself on the back of his trousers and he said, "Make him shit." And I just turned around and gave him a packet of senna leaves, and he smiled beautifully and he said, "Ah, you savvy now."
most original story.
It's a very original one. That's Well, the Chinamen on the whole here, they weren't a bad lot. There was one, and they often used to have the Chinese women come, and of course, unfortunately, sometimes some very pretty girls.
Yes.
There's one pretty girl came from Dunedin with a Chinaman had the store, and we had a dressmaking establishment attached to Cotter Brothers store,
Yes.
and old Lulu came in to me and he said he wanted to get some clothes for the lady and anything she wanted to give to her.
Mm-hmm.
Well, she got herself well fitted out with everything of the best in clothing, and then she wanted a dressing gown made and a frock. Took her into the dressmaker and she measured her and made all arrangements about it. So we went back to the store to select what was to be put on the dressing gown, made out of the dressing gown.
Yes.
And I showed her a piece of very pretty peacock blue rippling cloth that was very much used then for dressing gown, ladies' dressing gowns.
Yes.
And she said, "Now what will go with it?" And I pulled down a piece of cream satin. And I said, "Would you like this as a front?" she said, what a hell of a fright I'd looked in that bloody show. Well, she fell in my estimation. I didn't think she was a pretty girl at all.
No.
And she just got her costume and the dressing gown, and the Chinaman got up one morning and she was gone and all his money with her.
You're pretty right.
So that was my experience
Yes.
behind the counter. Some of them, not all.
Were there any mixed marriages between the Chinese and
Not up
the
here.
local women?
No. Oh,
No.
no. Different women came here and stayed a while, but they all seemed to come with the one idea that the Chinaman had the money.
Yes.
And they used to, of course, they would get away with it. If they didn't get away with the money, they got, well fitted out.
Mm-hmm. Did they live with the Chinese, did they?
Oh, yes, they lived with them.
Mm-hmm.
Lived with them. But it didn't happen very often.
No.
It was only occasionally that it did happen.
Well, I think you've given us some wonderful
Well,
stories
if it's
of
of
the
any
early
use
days,
to
Mrs.
you,
Hamilton.
I don't, I suppose I'll get a fright when I hear my
Unless
voice.
you've got one or two others that right in the tip of your tongue to tell us. I see it's getting on to your lunchtime.
Well,
We won't want to keep you.
Another day, just of late years, when old Mr. Romans was a man going on almost to the 100,
Yes.
he and Mr. Pierce, the policeman, Mr. James, were sitting on the bench in front of the Royal Oak Hotel one day, and their conversation drew themselves on to the other world. And I don't remember what Mr. James and Mr. Pierce said about it, but Mr. Roman said, well, I don't know anything about it, but I do hope when I get there they have a few race courses. He was very fond of racing. I don't have any other comments.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Hamilton. Much indebted to you for your sparing us the time to tell us these stories.
Well, thanks for friends today. He was born in Arrowtown. He came over from Sydney 4 years ago and came to see me. I better give my own name, had I? Mrs. Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked me if I could give him the recipe for the hop and the ginger beer that his father, James Begbie, used to make years ago in Arrowtown. I suppose about 50 years ago it would be. Unfortunately, I didn't have the recipe. Tom said if he had it in Sydney, he could make his fortune. But his father used to make the hop and ginger beer in huge big casks, 18 gallons each. And he would leave them so long, and then they would be bottled and corked and tied. And there was only one fence dividing Richard Cotter's place and James Begbie's, so that the Cotter children always did the bottling and the corking, and he showed every one of us the way to tie a bottle, which everybody now doesn't know how to do.
What do you tie it down with?
With a nice fine string, and cart it into his shop. Well, he had a boarding house, and his dining room was a very, very large, long dining room. He was usually packed out with boarders, and they'd play cards at night for a glass of shandy. A very, very long glass, I suppose now what would we call 10 ounces. And it was a sixpence for the glass of shandy. He left Arrowtown with his family, James Begbie, and went to Dunedin and had a shop there in the arcade. But as he couldn't make the hop and ginger beer, he wasn't as successful as he was here. But he was a very, very fine old fellow.
Thank you, Mrs. Hamilton. Yes, please tell us more about these gin cases.
Well, they made in such a way that they were very easy to put a child into. One or two children could sit in a gin case and be packed over the Crown Range, you see. When that was really the original way of coming, evidently, over the Crown Range, because William Elliot of Dunedin, he's still alive, and he told me that he was packed from the Dunstan to Arrowtown in a gin case. And he rode down Princess Street into Dunedin in the first motor car that was driven down to Princess Street.
Yes.
And I was in Dunedin the day that the first aeroplane came from Christchurch to Dunedin. I was there on holiday with my 3 little girls, and William Elliot, we all went out to see the aeroplane, and William Elliot was the first passenger in the aeroplane to go round Dunedin.
Were these gin cases painted?
Red,
Painted red.
dark red, and they seemed to have a binding round them. I don't know that I had anything very much to do with them, only I have seen them. And of course with the pack horses, I had quite a lot to do with pack horses years ago, because my brothers had the store at Bullendale, Cotter Brothers, and everything had to be packed.
And these gin cases slung over the pack
Yes,
horses.
well they didn't use the gin cases as much as they used the sacks at each side and then the big box on the top. The gin case or a big case would be on the top. But it was the chief way here for long enough of packing, both up to Macetown and to Bullendale, and then of course the families coming here.
Were they ever used for anything else up in the hills?
Oh, well, a gin case used to make a very nice cupboard. You see, a man batching would always watch out to get a nice gin case, a very nice clean one, to make a cupboard.
Yes.
Because you put a door on it and put a couple of shelves in it, and no mice or rats could get into it.
No.
I have a cupboard now, a little one, that my husband made up at Shotover,
Yes.
and nothing can get into.
Was that a gin case?
I don't know what it was out of. It may have been. It's a little cupboard, and it's painted a dark red. We've always kept it in dark colour.
And I suppose other items of furniture would be made out of the gin case.
Oh, yes. All the furniture in the early days here was made out of boxes. And the pink glazed calico and the hailstone muslin was the usual trimmings for because there's no such thing as a duchess, you know.
No.
They were made out of, the dressing tables were made out of boxes. I remember my mother had beautiful big boxes in our bedrooms at home and in her own, and shelves in them, and this pink glazed lining and the white muslin. And then when the kerosene came, that you would get the kerosene boxes. Well, it was wonderful what we used to do with the kerosene boxes, making chest of drawers and so forth out of them.
You mentioned rats and mice.
Mm-hmm.
Were there many of them in your time, the early days here?
Oh, yes, there was any amount of rats and mice about. In fact, sometimes there's quite a lot of them there.
Mm-hmm.
But you'd always on the watch to catch them. Horrible things. Just clear home.
What type of traps would they use in those days?
Springback, and then a rabbit trap, usually a rabbit trap. And then of course the springback rat trap came in. And they used to go in a good deal, you see, for poisoning. And they used to get the ferrets on the go and the little fox terriers. Fox terriers were great for catching the rats.
Yeah.
Is this all going down? Fred,
Yes.
you can listen to my voice.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
This is my little grandchild.